Hi, I'm Stephanie Smith, one of the co-curators of Commonwealth, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, Indigenous Movement. This program is presented as part of Commonwealth, which is a multi-year, multi-part project organized in collaboration between the Institute for Contemporary Art at VCU in Richmond, Vera Local in San Juan, and Philadelphia Contemporary. Through the project, we've been thinking about the term Commonwealth and really trying to think through whether it's possible to unleash the collective power of that term while also recognizing its connections to legacies of exploitation and colonialism. As a curatorial team, we've developed a set of components that include commissions from artists, virtual programs like this one, and also an online publication that you can find at commonwealths.art. That's Commonwealths with an S.art. And there you'll find kind of networks of content that are related to the project's themes. Tonight's program, Indigenous Movement, is going to be led by Candice Hopkins, who is a curator and writer. She's in conversation with artist and architect Tiffany Shaw-Collinge, artist Tanya Lukin Linklater, and Vanessa Bolin, who is one of the leaders of the Richmond Indigenous Society. And we're really grateful to them for being with us and shaping this program tonight. And I want to thank them for the pleasure of working on this project, especially given the very tumultuous times that we're in right now. It's really been a joy to work on this. Thanks also to everybody who's been involved in helping to support and shape this program, and all of you for being with us tonight. We hope that you'll be active participants and really use the chat function, and also please do direct your questions to the panelists using the Q&A function in Zoom, because that's what they'll be tracking as they move into that part of the program. Tonight's program was inspired by two works that are shown in Commonwealth. One is a piece that was created by Tanya and Tiffany for another exhibition for the 2019 Chicago Architecture Biennial. That's a piece called Indigenous Geometries. And then as a commission for Commonwealth, Tanya created a really beautiful new performance for camera called This Moment and Endurance to the End Forever. In just a couple of moments, we'll have a chance to see some images of those works installed at the ICA, where they remain on view until the end of this month. You'll also see, just to give proper credit, you'll also see fragments of two other artists in Commonwealth works created by Carolina Casedo and Sharon Hayes. After we go through those, the images and the clips from Tanya's video, the panelists will come up, they'll introduce themselves, and then move into the conversation. So again, thanks to all of you for being here. And Grayson, please pull up those images. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Candice Hopkins, your moderator for tonight. We're just waiting for everyone's cameras to come on and their microphones. First of all, I wanted to deeply thank VCU, in particular the Institute for Contemporary Art, for hosting us and hosting what I think is going to be a really incredible conversation. So as Tiffany said, we wanted to each take the opportunity to introduce ourselves, speak a little bit about where we are and where we come from. And I'll begin and then I'll pass the mic. I'm Candice Hopkins and I'm joining you here from Tiwa territory in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but I'm originally from a citizen of Carcross Tagish First Nation in the Yukon. And that's, for those who don't know, that's subarctic Canada. I work as both a writer and a curator. And I want to pass it off to Vanessa.
Oh, thank you. My name's Vanessa Bolin. I am currently in Virginia on so-called Virginia on occupied Pamunkey territory. I'm grew up most of my life in North Carolina. I'm Saponi and Tuscarora and got a few other things thrown in there, but I am an Indigenous artist, activist, founder of the Eyes Wide Open Project, one of the founders of Richmond Indigenous Society, Community Roots Garden, and work throughout different parts of the country and here in occupied Virginia, talking and bringing forth Indigenous sovereignty and food sovereignty, medical sovereignty, and just bringing about awareness of Indigenous issues such as murdered and missing Indigenous women.
Thanks, Vanessa, for that. I appreciate it. And Tiffany.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Shaw-Collinge. I am a Métis architect and artist from Edmonton, Alberta, or Amiskwaci Wasayagan, which is Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis Nation of Alberta. And I was born in Calgary and raised in Edmonton, but my family comes from Fort McMurray in Alberta.
Thanks, Tiffany. And finally, Tanya.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Tanya Lukin Linklater. I'm speaking from Nibising and Anishinaabe territory in Northern Ontario, Canada, where I live and work. And I'm from the native villages of Afognak and Port Lions in southwestern Alaska in the Kodiak Island archipelago. I'm a Lutuk and I'm an artist and happy to be participating in the conversation tonight.
So I wanted to begin, Tanya and Tiffany, with a work that we just witnessed. The first two slides were of Indigenous Geometries, and that was a work that was first shown and commissioned as part of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, but most recently was at the VCU Institute for Contemporary Art. For me, I think that the work opens up a great deal of questions and also potential relations. It's truly a relational artwork. I think that it's important that you saw different iterations of it. It can be assembled, it can be deassembled, it can be taken apart, it can be refigured. When you first described the work, you both talked about how colonial governments have actively dismantled Indigenous social structures. And in thinking about that, I was also thinking about how Indigenous architectures are inherently social. And that also comes through in the work as well. But I feel that your piece is also more optimistic than that. It, while it can be broken down, the parts can always be remade into another piece. And I think that there's resistance in that. And Tanya, you've also described the work in saying that it's in response to the idea that we are in a process of putting ourselves back together again, that this work with Indigenous communities is a result of ongoing settler colonialism and our continual efforts to recover and regain ourselves, given devastating federal policies that have actively worked to dismantle our languages, families, ceremonies and ideas. So I was wondering if both of you might expand on your original ideas and intents for the piece, and knowing that it's taken on, of course, a different form in COVID, and also, you know, generated this new video as well.
So Tiffany, feel free to interject anytime. I'll just start from the beginning, which was I gave a talk and I was speaking just generally about my practice, and there was a group of Indigenous architects who attended the talk, and then they asked me how I would imagine a space for Indigenous performance. And it was an important question because I didn't have an answer immediately, because they weren't asking me to discuss Indigenous performance as it exists within the context of community. They were asking me to imagine a space. And I sort of took that question with me and realized that oftentimes when I'm working within the museum, I'm working with these difficult structures, and I'm responding to the constraints of those structures, specifically in relation to Indigenous peoples and cultural belongings and our ideas. And so I started to consider this question as a question that spoke to imagining a space outside of domination. And I was approached by the co-curator of And Other Such Stories, and she just wanted to begin to have a conversation. And so I thought about that question immediately. And I decided to ask Tiffany to join me as a part of the project. I thought that it was important. We had developed a relationship over time and had worked together on other projects. I just thought it might be helpful to have her in her experience and thinking alongside, as I sort of imagined a kind of architectural space. And we embarked on a process of conversation. You know, I had some knowledge of Chicago, mostly through the writings of Indigenous women poets like Joy Harjo and Susie Sillock. And in both instances, they were speaking about relocation specifically as a historical moment. And I was thinking a great deal about the urban Indigenous population in Chicago, partly. And so we started a series of conversations, and I think that that's sort of the spirit of how we entered into this conversation tonight, was just to sort of talk through a little bit of what that experience was like. But I will say that, Candice, you actually pointed me in the direction of a text. It was kind of a manifesto, a credo for American Indian theater in 1969. That was developed by faculty and students at the Institute for American Indian Arts. And I really am interested in this time, just generally in terms of what was happening within art, within political movements, with Indigenous people, but otherwise. And so I sort of used that text, which really referred to perhaps the structure of Indigenous performance, referred to what the space might look like, spoke to a different kind of time, and spoke to ritual time and structures that were not within a Western paradigm of the dramatic arc that happens within performance. So maybe I'll ask Tiffany to join the conversation, because her entry point into the conversation, of course, also shifted it and shifted the process as well.
Well, I think just to add to that is when Tanya and I worked together originally, a few years prior to that, Tanya had made these really beautiful wood sifters, and it required 2 people to pick them up and move them. And that was part of her process that she had told us directly. I'm part of a curatorial collective, and we had asked Tanya along with Dwayne Linklater to be in this exhibition. And I always really remembered that moment of how Tanya really connected the body to these objects, which is something that we do in architectural theory as well, is how does the body move through space? And so when she had asked that really beautiful question about what does Indigenous performance look like, we really talked, we had several long conversations using the text that she had just mentioned as one of the bases, along with a poem as well. And, but I can't remember the poem now, that I can't remember specifically.
I think it was Adventure in Chinatown, 1958, if I by Susie Sillock.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
And so that was just nice to have like a bit of a context of a jumping off point, because we always recognize that we're not alone in this conversation, that there are many voices before us. So it's like, how can we mark what has already happened, and how can we continue the conversation in a thoughtful way for our children as well? And I think that we tried to also discuss like what was in the surroundings around us that we wanted to discuss. And the Lutic environment had come up often because Tanya had just done some discovery through some works that she had looked at in the museum, and she'll often do work with the archives, such as, and I will as well. And so we wanted to explore that kind of craft. That's sort of how I always explore architecture, is like, what is the locality of work, and we can bring that voice forward. And so we looked at like the steam bending of visors. We also looked at the domestic space, which are the chilliwacks. And those are actually interesting. Those are built within the earth. And so that's a whole other thing. We also talked about one thing that's another architectural quality, which is atmosphere. So the inside versus the outside of a teepee. And you know, how that quality is different. How the threshold space between inside and outside is so critical for Indigenous people. This comes up in all of my architectural work when dealing with within communities on reserve and off reserve and in urban environments. And so we looked at all of those things. We also looked at sort of bags and baskets as well, sort of the patterning. And so you saw some like copper paint on some of those spines. We call them spines. People call them ribs as well. And so we really wanted to kind of bring in that language so that it had a home. And then we also looked at, when we were working with an all-woman fabrication team in Chicago to help us create it, which is just important and amazing in and itself, we were talking about the locality of the material that we were bringing in. And so when Stephanie engaged us to further that conversation with the ICA, we talked about sort of what does locality, what does the local voice mean in this context? And so that was just a continuation that we moved from Chicago into here.
Yeah, and that's a great way to bring, Vanessa, your perspective into this conversation, because you were one of the people who became a collaborator, you know, on this work, as a way to extend it, as a way to think about, you know, its relationship to the local where you are. But one of the things that you brought up almost immediately, and I think that this was resonating in Chicago too, is how, you know, both these cities are cities of radical displacement of Indigenous people as well. So of course we embrace architectures that come out of migration, and certainly that's also at the heart of Indigenous geometries. But I also think that these important conversations, not only of displacement, but willful diaspora as well. Vanessa, you wear many hats as an activist, as a bead worker, as an artist. One of the things that you have spoken about within your work is how we can, as Indigenous people, question colonially imposed borders, including the one that now divides the US and Canada, directly intersecting our communities. I was recently having a conversation with the Anishinaabe artist, Andrea Carlson, who's now based in Chicago, and she calls these colonial earth drawings, which I really liked, because it also means that maybe one day they can be erased. I wondered, Vanessa, if you wanted to speak more about your work as an organizer and also as an activist, and, you know, through that, how you're reframing or rethinking borders.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I so appreciate the art that I've got to see. It's beautiful, and it resonated with me. I felt immediately drawn to it. Reminded me of Whalebones, but it's particularly telling. So borders for a colonial mindset are a thing. For us as Indigenous people, it really has no meaning because this is our continent. And these aren't people from other tribes. These are my relatives. Um, Rebecca, Tanya, these Tiffany, like these different people, these are my relatives. We are all related. These borders, these imaginary borders are so colonial. Um, some men got together, decided, hey, you get this part of this continent, you get this part, you get that. But for us, it has no meaning. It's kind of like time. I so appreciate you talking about time. Time is such a colonial thing. That clock is not real. Our people, our tribes lived by the sun and the moon and the seasons and the time of the year. Our ceremonies are deeply embedded in that. So as we look at what's going on in the borders, um, in the imaginary borders, what is happening with people being imprisoned on an imaginary border, people who belong on this continent from time through eternity, they traveled from the very furthest south to the very furthest north. There were trade routes. There were, they came together, they met, they hunt. They did all of these things. So these borders have no meaning to us. They are, right now, we literally have a wall that is dividing tribes, literally going right through the middle of tribes and separating our relations from one another. And with each part of these so-called borders, we look at the systemic racism that we face as Indigenous people. Canada is particularly bad. Mexico, Peru, all the way down, all the way up, we are treated in an unfair manner. I spend a lot of time when I talk and I remind people that it wasn't until the 1920s, that the Indigenous people in the so-called United States actually were recognized as citizens on our own lands. What is wrong with that? What does that tell you, that colonial mindset of every Indigenous person, that we do not matter? They look at us as less than what they are. So a lot of times when I talk, I bring these issues up. There is, especially as women, as Indigenous people, there is a deep-seated problem here again that goes from the furthest south to the furthest north, all the way up to the top of Canada, of our murdered and missing Indigenous women and people. It is systemic. Right now, there's over 4,500 missing Indigenous women and people that aren't being investigated, that aren't being looked for, unless they're being looked for by their families, their tribes, their friends. It is a systemic problem. So we have more commonality as Indigenous people across this country than we do, than we don't. From poverty to oppression, especially when it comes to environmental issues, how the colonizers want to extract everything from our Mother Earth and just destroy and tear down and abuse and use. But our voice is getting powerful. It is gaining strength. Our oppression is starting to be seen by more people. So those are some of the things I work on, especially talking about food sovereignty and food justice. And this is really what it's about. It's about justice, that we deserve justice as Indigenous people to have access to all of our lands, all of our lands. And that's this entire continent. We have a right as the First Nations people to everything.
Yeah, exactly, Vanessa. One of the things that I was thinking about, in this expanded idea of movement, and you've of course put your finger on that, is the self-organized movements that we have as Indigenous people, and how those movements are now holding others to account, holding governments to account, right? I think the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls is one of them. The movement against the DPL pipeline was another. And, it's interesting to me to think that one of the ways I think that we've learned is how to improvise always, especially when you're kind of under attack. And I think that, the spaces that we make and the architectures that we make are reminiscent of this as well. One thing that I immediately thought of when I saw this piece, Indigenous Geometries, was actually of Métis road allowance houses, and that history, and how for Métis people who were often, didn't have the right to live on reserve, and also didn't have the right or the means to buy land, were living sort of in these places that were kind of left behind for the expansion of future roads. And they had to live and make very temporary homes because they were persecuted. Sometimes their homes were burned down. But one of the things that really resonates for me about that history, which Tiffany knows better than I do, is when I was speaking with different Métis people about that, especially people like Marie Campbell, she says that those were places that were also extraordinarily happy because they made their own space the way that they wanted. She says that it was filled with song and dance. So that's something that I'm reminded of in this piece as well. And I was also really heartened to see things like, it's very minor, but the copper embellishments, because that for us as Northwest Coast people, as Tanya knows, is a signification of wealth. Some people will think of it as a kind of conduit, of course, copper is a conduit, but it's really our wealth. And the Americas were filled with wealth. That's what we were known for before others came. So I loved that there was that bit in it. And, Vanessa, you also described the installation is kind of looking like ribs, and that's immediately what I thought too. I thought of these massive whale bones. That's more in line with the architecture from where Tanya's from. But then I was thinking about how bodies become structures that enclose us, that support us, how our families then can be seen as a kind of extension of that. And then I was thinking again of migration, this ethos that's grounded in movement, the ability to improvise in these times of crisis. And Tiffany, you've already mentioned this, but how architecture conditions us either in its mobility or in its stasis. So I wondered if anyone wanted to take that up to maybe expand a bit on this thinking about migration as an Indigenous way of being, perhaps migration as a kind of form of resistance as well.
Well, I think, thank you, everyone, for what you've been saying so far. It's really, it really kind of adds another kind of liveness to the work, which is really beautiful, which I'm really enjoying listening to. It brings this kind of liveness that we weren't able to activate in performance in this iteration due to COVID. One of the things that I think about in terms of maybe not migration, but possibly is this idea of containment. And so I think we were talking about borders, and I often think about the pass system in Canada and how people were not allowed, First Nations folks were not allowed to leave the reserve unless they had written approval by the Indian agent. And so there was this active containment in the accumulation of land and sort of the dispossession of land from Indigenous people. But there was also a series of kind of epistemic violences that happened over time and that we continue to sort of deal with or reckon with as Indigenous people. And I think that partly it's a containment of ourselves as well. So the ideas about us as Indigenous people, they can be incredibly reductive. And, Vanessa, you pointed towards this when you were discussing kind of the ways in which we're dehumanized as Alaska Native people, Native American people, First Nations, Métis, Inuit peoples in North America, or Indigenous folks in North America. So I'm really interested in allowing our ideas of ourselves to be willfully diasporic, as you said, Candace, but also to allow those ideas of ourselves to sort of resist and exceed that containment. For me, I often think about embodiment in relation to, in this case, this sculpture, this kind of architecture. But in that, I also think about the mind, and that's really rooted in Alaska Native ideas about the mind and the power of the mind, and the ways in which we need to be kind to others and never harm another person's mind. That's a Yupik ethic that I've learned over time from Alaska, and I guess that's, for me, that we're rooting these ideas in a kind of materiality in Indigenous geometries, but it really is kind of about the ways in which ideas of ourselves can exceed these sort of reductionist views of indigeneity that have been incredibly harmful to us. So even though they're ideas, they have real lived impacts in our experiences. Maybe I'll hand it over to someone else if they want to also respond.
Yeah, I think that migration conversation was definitely also part of what we talked about too. And I think that's why the pieces can be disassembled individually. It's like for your own sovereignty, I think, essentially in that space. And all of those things, like Tanya had said, I also appreciate what you have both layered in there, Vanessa and Candice. Those conversations did touch our work as well. And so that mobility of the work is incredibly important. And so we often talk about, should it stay as a full container or vessel, we've called it sometimes, or do we break it apart? And we're often talking about the importance of, like, 2 of the spines, I think, right? 2 of them, Tanya, are at her space right now, so that she has like a linkage to them. And we talk about maybe some of them coming here, and the importance of that relationship that you have to the structure, and that it is separate from the institution, because often when we come in or are asked to create work in the institution, it's like by those rules. And this was a way to break apart from that and to have our own space. And so when we really looked at that question that Tanya had proposed, of from questions that was asked prior, what does Indigenous performance look like? All of these things had come to that forefront to be answered, and that movement was really important. And on top of sort of like how you are allowed or not allowed to move into space or out of space in territory, it's really a part of our nature to shift even seasonality. So like where we go in the summer versus where we go in the winter for harvests. And so I think all of that is within the work. And I think that it's nice to see you pick up those pieces.
Oh my gosh, thank you for saying that, both of you. As I'm hearing you talk about migration, there's forced migration, and then there's chosen migration. And many of our relatives were forced to migrate into what the colonizers thought of as the lesser of the land. Okay, you go west of the Mississippi and this is Indian territory. That's where you're going to be. And there's chosen migration. So I'm an urban Indigenous person. I have chosen that. I've lived on a reservation. I've lived off a reservation. I've lived in the country. I've lived in the city, and the beauty of it is it's my choice. It's my choice to migrate wherever I go, wherever I decide to be, wherever I decide to live. I am making that choice, and that was a choice that was taken away from my ancestors. That was something that my relatives were forced into this migration. I've chosen this. And I really do travel a lot. I've been up in Canada. and maybe snuck across the border, and been in Mexico, maybe stuck across that imaginary border, like, because it's all mine. I have a right to be there. I'm going to go wherever I want to go. And it's that mindset that my children, my grandchildren, their children, this is their land. They can go wherever they want to go. When it comes to the art, I love that you have pieces with you. And I love that it can be disassembled, because it reminds me of our people. Colonizers tried to disassemble us, spiritually, physically, emotionally, from the land, from our homes, from who we are as people, from our language, from our traditions and our culture. And guess what? We reassembled it. We brought it back together. We built something new and beautiful, and we're reclaiming that, and we're writing our own history now. We have those rights as Indigenous people. It's like in this art, it can be taken apart, but guess what? It can be put back together into something totally new and beautiful, or it can be put back exactly the way it used to be. And so I appreciate that about this piece particularly. The copper in it is, I really wish people could get up close and personal with it and see how extraordinarily smooth and beautiful, and how there's this power that comes from it. And it's very much, it felt like home. It felt very comfortable to me to be around it, to move around it, and to recognize it as something sacred and beautiful. So, thank you.
Wow. It's such a beautiful description, Vanessa. Thank you for it. I feel like, embodied by the piece just through your words. I was thinking as well, and I wanted to expand on this too, about, another element of movement in this work is, not just the physicality of it, the fact that you can just assemble it, reassemble it, or even, Tiffany, as you said, like maybe every person has a piece, and maybe that piece, that single piece, becomes the basis for new ones, right? They like kind of populate. But I was also thinking about movement's relationship to choreography. Tanya, you're trained as a choreographer. You often collaborate with dancers, and this was no exception, except for this, I think, had a bit of a turn where you normally do what you call a process of open rehearsal. In this case, you've really done these performances for the camera. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about how you saw kind of movement and choreography in relation to this work specifically, and perhaps even what changed as a result of doing that for the camera.
Sure. So in the original, we did a very condensed open rehearsal process at the Chicago Architecture Biennial in December 2019, and Tiffany joined us, which was really, I think, crucial and quite lovely to have her there, because we made some additional choices about which spines would be removed from the base, how they would sort of live, within the museum, who they'd be in relation to. But I think I had always intended for this kind of investigation of the spines. And what came to be very clear to me in that particular open rehearsal process was that I wanted each dancer to investigate one spine. So if we think about all of the different structures that make up or made up or do make up our Indigenous communities prior to contact, and then of course to today, there would be many different pieces, governance and education and health. But I thought that perhaps because of my own interest, I would focus on songs and on language. And so each dancer was sort of tasked with either the idea of the spine embodying songs, Indigenous songs, or Indigenous languages. And what I mean by that is a bit expanded. So songs might be ceremonial songs or powwow songs, or the song of the violin that accompanied the performance with Laura Ortman, who's just a phenomenal composer and musician who joined the project. And the dancers are Kynwan Gobert and Ivani Abanmalo, and I've worked with both of them for many, many years as well. So I just want to acknowledge them because they're quite remarkable in their generosity as dancers. And so the songs was one investigation, or one, I called them simultaneous duets, because they were having a duet between the dancer and the spine, but they were simultaneous duets that were taking place. And there was this kind of gentle care that was involved in this investigation of that sculpture. And so I think there's the work itself, Indigenous Geometries as a whole, but I really consider each one of those spines to be their own sculpture as well. And so one was investigating songs and the other was investigating language. And for me, language was the conversation that was taking place between us, that was shared amongst us. So all of our voices, as well as the language that was within the poems that were also helping us to score the solos that took place by the two poets, Joy Harjo and Susie Sillick. And then I was also thinking about Indigenous languages and the ways in which we're working, our communities are working to recover our Indigenous languages, because so much of our knowledges are held within them. And so for me, this was kind of about recovery. It was about repair. It was about care involved in this. They came to embody these ideas. So in that, I mean, I felt like it was a very condensed investigation. I was really looking forward to sort of a deeper investigation over the course of a residency at ICA at BCU. But because of the context of the pandemic, I pivoted and instead chose to implement a new methodology, which was remote rehearsals over Zoom. So we had lots and lots of conversation. And then the dancers would sort of do improvisational investigations based on the concepts that we were sort of looking at, and they would record themselves and send those recordings to me. And in that way, I gave feedback, and then we started to build the movement for the performance for camera, which was in two parts. The first part was those spines with me here in my living room. And I think that that's significant because when we're talking about policies, federal policies in the US and Canada that dismantled Indigenous peoples and dispossessed us from our lands, we can't forget the legacy of Indian residential schools or boarding schools in the United States and Canada. And so for me to bring those spines into my home and to be making this performance for camera within my home with those spines is really gesturing towards this idea of the intactness or the work to keep the home intact. And then in the second part, the dancers were investigating sort of the textures and tones of breath and the idea of atmospheres, which are denser, close to the earth, and then dissipate outwards into the cosmos. I don't know what else to say about that yet, because I feel like I'm still reflecting on it. But it was a really, it felt like a really good way to try to address the moment that we're in. Yeah, so maybe that's all I'll say about that.
That was really nice, Tanya. I feel like it was the beginning of a poem there. What I appreciated though is also your kind of centering song. You described some of it as a duet, which people can understand as both, you know, a piece and dance, but also as something that exists in song. And song became a part of the piece as well in Richmond when it was enacted. Vanessa's shaking her head. And what I was thinking about actually is how the idea of, Tanya, what I think that you just described is a sense of what I might call Indigenous poetics, and how song and sound have a role in that. And then I was thinking as well, Vanessa, the role of song in our present political movements and social movements as Indigenous people, and thinking about in Canada how people gathered around song as part of the Idle No More movement, and round dance songs were played often commonly because it's a kind of song and a rhythm that almost everyone can participate in. And so then, you know, you have this sort of broader political potential. So I'm not sure if that's really a question, or Vanessa, if you wanted to expand on that, but I was thinking about, yeah, exactly that, the political potential of song, because it is an organizing principle that brings us together as Indigenous people to share in one voice.
Yeah. So our songs are even our round dance songs. They're our some of them are very fun and funny, but our songs are our prayers. They are our history. They're um, they're a way to convey to the next generation these songs that have been around for hundreds of years. There are stories, they're who we are as people. So anytime in art, which music and song is an art unto itself, but it takes on a different meaning, I think, for our culture, that it's a perpetuation of who we are as people. It's making sure that our next generation can share those stories. There are many, many of our songs that talk about great battles. They talk about people. They talk about life as a whole. And that brings in our language, which we want to sometimes, because of colonization, because of these different languages coming in and it being forced to be our primary language, we've lost so many languages. There weren't just like 2 or 3 or 4 languages. There were hundreds of languages. And today it's a beautiful thing that so many tribes, so many Indigenous people are trying to learn and reclaim and to figure out these lost languages. And they're going back into history. They're going into archives and writings and things that have been around since the colonizers came over, to recapture that, to bring that language back, to bring back that, because speaking those words speak power to us as people. And COVID has really hit our Indigenous relatives hard. We have lost so many elders. It's not just about the loss of them as a human being, but of the stories, of the language, of the knowledge that we are losing because of this pandemic. It's devastating to us as people. Every elder loss is a piece of knowledge that we're not going to be able to get. So I encourage people now, especially our Indigenous youth and Indigenous people, go talk to your elders. Go listen to them. Well, don't go to them because of COVID, but call them on the phone. Get a tape recorder. Like, ask them words. Even if you only speak one word of your traditional language a day, if you only know that one word, do it every day, because it keeps our language alive. It keeps us alive. It keeps our relatives alive and our tribe. So yeah, appreciate the language aspect. And one thing is, as Tanya was talking, as Tiffany were talking, especially about the movement and the dance that went with this, I don't think it was just chance. I think it's beautiful that that was performed next to water, next to flowing, moving water, because water is life. We know that. Indigenous tribes knew the importance of water, and many tribes were near rivers and creeks and lakes and oceans. So that flowing water, we knew that meant that the water was going to be healthy and to be able to be drink from, and all of these things. So movement and the language of it all came together with the physical of it all, and just the most perfect way. I hope that made sense. It did in my head.
Total sense.
Well, I wondered if I could just add to that, though, because Tanya has mentioned before, which I think follows the same note about, and she might say something a bit differently, but about sound sort of being absorbed in the material. And I think when we saw the song, we both felt really emotional about that, because it was like building up the history of that work, like creating more resonance for it. And I'm sure Tanya will say something else, but I think that it plays within that whole thing about how the walls are filled. And it just really makes me think about when my great grandmother passed away. My grandmother would play tapes of her speaking Cree in the house, and just that sound and that familiarity of language filling. And so I think it makes me think of all those things, which are quite beautiful memories.
Yeah, I just want to say like that there's a woman named Lily Hope, who is a chilkat weaver in Southeast Alaska, who I met many, many, many years ago and have stayed in touch with over time. And I remember her and her mom speaking about, and I've said this a couple of times, but I remember her and her mom speaking very clearly about when you're weaving, you know, your sound will enter into that and stay in that garment. And so you would never argue around it. You know, you would cover it. You cover the garment when you're not weaving it, so that because everything will enter into it. And if you're making a garment or beadwork or any other kind of very special regalia for people, they're then going to wear that and they're going to carry that with them. And so the sound that's entering into it is important. And I would even extend that. She didn't say this, but the other things that I think about when I think within a context, Alaska Native context, is they often say, not only should your words not harm other people, but even your thoughts. So you have to kind of rein it in, you know, because your thoughts also have power. And I don't think that it's only Alaska Native folks that you know, have historically ascribed to this idea. And so when we are having conversation near Indigenous geometries, or the sound of the violin, or, you know, Tiffany and I brought some of our family members, as well as Ivani, our family is then also there kind of laughing or making sound near it. All of that's entering into the sculpture, as well as the song that Vanessa and other community members sang to the sculpture. And I would say that now with the two spines that are living with me in my home, all of the sound is entering into those two spines. They may stay with me forever. I don't know. You know, maybe they want to be here with me in my home. Maybe they'll return to the sculpture, the larger work. But I think that that's a really important point, Tiffany, because it's certainly something that continuously comes up in this work.
Well, and also when we were going to work with the ICA in terms of being in the space, there was this conversation about how the work gets touched, how it travels, and making sure that that was a protected space as well. And I think that was a really wonderful conversation that we were having, to know the potential of like the preparatory experience could also be part of that performance. And so, you know, I'm looking forward to when this work travels again, like those conversations about how this work is treated, because it is a body, right? And it is to be protected and or respected. And so I think that that's interesting too.
Some of the members of Richmond Indigenous Society, we had brought our hand drums, and we had done a little ceremony, but we felt and wanted to sing a song to honor that sculpture, and as a blessing and a thank you for the power of it. So it was really a beautiful moment, and it was very heartfelt, and several of us got emotional. We really felt it. And anybody who's ever heard a drum or been at a powwow and really got into the moment, we were really in that moment. It was like the whole museum disappeared, and we were just there with that piece of art and singing to it and honoring it and putting all the love into it that we could. So yeah, the sound and the words meant a lot in that time and place, and we were all very present and felt it, and it was just a precious moment that I will never forget. because of the emotion that it evoked in myself and other people. You could see it on their face. You could see the glisten in the eyes, and it was amazing. And it was not necessarily planned. It was felt like this is the time we need to do this. So that piece of art invoked in us a song that we honored it with.
You've already beat me to the punch in speaking about and describing reclamation. It's something that I thought we would end with, but maybe I'll just end with this remark and then invite anyone out there who's listening to us right now to please, if you have questions, post them in the Q&A, and we'd be happy to speak to them. One of the things that I was thinking about reclamation, and this is definitely what's, this work has enabled, is a kind of other protocols of relation. And I think it's at the heart of all of your practices, whether it's as artists or activists and community organizers, is that it works against the violence of historical amnesia, against the active forgetting of colonial violence and the genocide in mainstream culture and media, as well as the way that this amnesia continues to affect us in our everyday lives. So I was thinking about, how this work kind of frames that idea of reclamation, but also how it enacts a kind of other idea of how we're bringing things back to ourselves. For me, I've called this a kind of form of repatriation otherwise, but in this case, this is something that never left us. So we've been able to, at Tanya, as you've, so beautifully described, embed it with this kind of well-being and put it in the world. And I'm really hoping that these kind of sets of relations are things that can, continue to be enacted, because I think that this idea of care and well-being as it relates to all of our lives, but also the things in our lives, is an incredibly important topic, especially right now. I don't see any questions yet in the Q&A, so I wondered if anyone, had any ideas of to expand on that, or we can offer some closing thoughts.
Well, I can share a little bit just to say, that I think a great deal about repair and restoration and repatriation. But I think that this language around well-being is really apt, because if I think about the context of, while my work is contemporary and, I situate it within contemporary dance, or, I work with avant-garde composers or contemporary artists and architects like Tiffany, I'm working with these ideas of restoration and repair, and I'm really rooting that within what I know of Alaska Native dance, and what I know of Alaska Native dance, Inupiaq dance, Yupik dance, Alutiiq dance, is that, when we're dancing, we're doing a number of things, many different actions simultaneously, depending on the needs of the person who's dancing. So we might be learning about many different things, because there are stories inside of that. But we're also keeping ourselves healthy. We're kind of like moving the energy in our body, and it's sort of like this preventative action. But it can also be really important to sort of lift the spirits of someone who's grieving or who's experiencing sorrow, for them to come together and be with other people and to experience laughter. There are other dances that are teasing dances and can kind of help to set people into a place of maybe more appropriate behavior, whatever that means. But I guess that's really how I think about dance, and how I think about the work that I do is, there are many different kinds of work that need to be happening right now. Work that's addressing violence directly, work that's addressing ideas of like decolonization or history. But I think that my role within and my responsibility within this work is really connected to those ideas of repair and well-being, and that really is a guiding ethic for the work. And I think really kind of situates my relationships in this work. So with Tiffany, and with Ivani and Kindwin and Laura, and now extended outwards to other folks as well, those who've joined us here in conversation. So Candice and Vanessa and Stephanie, who came to visit us in Chicago to see the work. So I guess that's just what I'd like to leave folks with is, if we think about the violence of historical amnesia, it can feel overwhelming, but I think that there are sorts of small actions that we can take, minor actions every day that our people in our community are doing all the time as well, in our communities are doing all the time. And so this is just one of those kinds of actions that's being undertaken.
Because of Tanya and Tiffany's work and all of these artists, Wilma Mankiller, who was the principal chief for the Cherokee Nation, made a comment one time that if you have one drop of Indian blood, you are. I don't think it's about the blood, just necessarily the blood, but it's about the DNA. At some point in time, Indigenous people, something wakes up that DNA. Something resonates, be it music, seeing someone dance, seeing a piece of art. That DNA gets woken up and they become hungry. They become woke. They wake up from this colonizer mindset. They wake up to something and they become hungry for something they did not realize they were hungry for. And they start seeking out answers, and they start exploring and reaching for languages and traditions and things. All of this work, all of these things are helping to wake up someone's DNA. They're helping to wake up those ancestors that live within them. So all of these things come together in the most powerful way, on the most personal and spiritual level inside of every Indigenous person. I can't thank you all, especially for the beautiful art and the dance and the deep thought and real perspective that went into it. Thank you for having me here, and hopefully this will continue to travel and migrate to other areas and help wake up maybe some sleeping DNA, and also help some of those who know exactly who they are look at things in a different way and appreciate who they are and continue to empower them.
Oh, that's very kind, Vanessa. I mean, Tanya and I were talking about this a little bit earlier today about hopefulness within our own work. And I specifically like to create structures that make people feel more part of themselves or more part of a network. And I think it's always about the visibility is really important. And like we know with beading, it's a very specific kind of coded index. We know like where people come from based on beading. And so we have this wonderful language visually that just is missing in architecture, in my opinion, like in the structures that we occupy today. And so I think that's what we were trying. Well, that's what I'm always trying to do. And that's what we talked about a lot about, was how can we make sure that this feels familiar to Indigenous people. And I think just your comments are so wonderful and helpful in understanding that you do identify a lot of those principles as well.
I just wanted to thank everyone. Thank you really deeply for all of your generosity of thought. Vanessa, Tiffany, Tanya, and also to thank our hosts, Stephanie, for inviting us all to be a part of this, and to the ICA for so graciously making this happen. I also wanted to note that if anyone wants to see the entire video, it will be included in a forthcoming publication that's available at commonwealths.art. So keep your eye on that so you can see the entire thing. And also wanted to thank everyone who's out there listening. Yeah, have a great evening, everyone. Take care.